Hello, welcome to On Wildlife. I'm your host, Alex Ray. On this podcast, we bring the wild to you. We take you on a journey into the life of a different animal every week, and I guarantee you're going to come out of here knowing more about your favorite animal than you did before. It's finally 2022, so we have a special episode to celebrate the new year. I'm not just talking about one animal this week, because I got to sit down with Danielle Koehler, the illustrator and author of the book, The Other Forest. Her book was inspired by the animals that she came in contact with when she visited the local animal rescue center near her home in Chile. She's come to talk to us about how animal conservation can come in all shapes and sizes by sharing some of her own experiences. So let's learn a little bit more about creative conservation. Danielle was born in the US, but now lives in southern Chile. And she has so many interesting stories to tell us about the differences that she's noticed between the two countries that she's lived in. So now, let's hear about why Danielle wanted to become an author and an illustrator.
Sure. Well, yes, I'm very different from the other guests that you've had on your podcast. I'm not a biologist or a scientist by any means. I consider myself an artist first and foremost, and that would be visual art. So an illustrator and a designer. And I just recently published a book, so I now am an author as well. And where that overlaps with wildlife is that my book, even though it is fantasy, was inspired by the local wildlife here in Chile, where I actually live, which is a whole other story, but definitely inspired me to write this book, just learning about these animals.
And now she's living in Chile, so what inspired her to move there?
I did a study abroad in 2010 and met my now husband and eventually followed him here. But for anybody who loves nature, this is a beautiful country to live in. I've met several Europeans. I don't know why Europeans find themselves moving here and falling in love with the nature and the animals, but yes, so I've enjoyed living here for sure.
Danielle also brought up the fact that being immersed in different cultures and even speaking different languages can change how you see the world around you.
When I first got here, there was a shooting in the metro, and coming from the United States, that's something that's all too common to us. And I remember being shocked that people were making such a big deal out of one person being injured. And they looked at me and they said, "You don't understand, this doesn't happen here." So that right off the bat opened my mind to, I'm living in a different culture, I'm living in a different country. The things that I'm used to are not what they're used to. And then just speaking another language also is you have to be more flexible, just the way that you think. And there's been tons of research on that as well, but how bilinguals view the world.
And one of the reasons why speaking in a different language can really make you think differently is because some words that have meanings in one language don't even exist in another language.
A really good example of a word that does not exist in Spanish in particular is the word upset. And you don't think about how often you use this word until it does not exist in the language that you need it to exist in, because it's kind of a blanket word for when you're just not feeling well. But what does it really mean? Are you angry? Are you, I was about to say, are you upset? No. Are you sad? Are you depressed? Are you disappointed? So not having that word forces you to think about how you're actually feeling and be a little bit more specific. So it also does, it's kind of like you're learning about who you are too, because you're lacking the proper words, and vice versa. There are words that exist in Spanish that, my husband and I are both bilingual. So oftentimes we'll be speaking in English and I'll just throw out a word to him in Spanish. And I really miss that when I'm only speaking to an English speaker, because there are words that are just so useful in both languages.
After Danielle moved to Chile, she started to illustrate the animals at the local animal rescue center.
So I've always loved animals, and that was obviously something that I was very excited about when I moved specifically to the south of Chile, because this is the home of the puma. I mean, there are pumas in Santiago, and you saw a lot of news stories when the pandemic hit that the pumas were actually coming down into the city in Santiago. But here where I live now, which is 10 hours south of Santiago by car, there are just pumas literally everywhere. So that was exciting for me. And the reason that I found this rescue center was because my mom actually, the puma is her favorite animal. And so when she first came to visit, I was intent on finding a place where she could see a puma in real life. I wanted to give her that experience. And so I found this rescue center here called Romawe. And at the time, they had 3 pumas. They had a lot of foxes, owls. They had this type of parrot, which is actually the most southern parrot in the world. I don't know the English name. It's Korocholoi. I can look it up if you want, but it looks like this like Bolivian tropical parrot, but then it's down in like cold Patagonia. So it's really, really funny. But so we went there, and I remember just being kind of enamored by the stories that the tour guide was telling us of these animals, because they each had names. You know, if there's only 4 pumas, obviously you're going to be able to point out, oh, that one is Nguyen, that one is Lolo, that one's Ayun. And 2 of them got there at the same time. And even though they weren't siblings, they weren't from the same mother, they had both lost their mothers at the same time. So they basically bonded over that, and were able to be kept in the same cage because of that. So I just loved that story. And then the story of the fox that I fell in love with her name was Ruda. She's unfortunately no longer with us, but she had 3 paws and was the leader of the other foxes. And I just thought, and Ruda in Spanish is a very like tough name. It can literally mean like tough, or like sometimes it can mean literally rude, but not all the time. It's also a plant here, which I like. But so I really love like this little bold fox, this little 3-legged fox that was the leader of the other foxes and gained their respect. So I just love that story too. And that I started illustrating them because my husband took their pictures, and I, as an artist, that was my immediate go-to art form, was to pick up colored pencils and draw them. It was not to write a book about it by any means. I did not think that would be what I would be doing. And, you know, if I could go back 4 years and say, oh, by the way, you've written a book, I would be shocked. So yes, I first started illustrating them. And then because these stories that I learned while I was visiting the center were in the back of my mind, by the time I hung the portraits of the animals, I really did feel like they kept whispering to me, like, there's more to us. You have to tell our story. So, you know, after finally giving in and sitting down and writing a very sloppy short story, I was lucky enough to find a critique group of other English-speaking writers here that helped me transform it to what it is today. But yes, it all started with that first tour of the rescue center.
It must have been so amazing to see those animals up close. Danielle also mentioned that the way that we as a society view animals in the United States is different from how people in Chile view animals.
I want to be a little bit careful here because I know that there are a lot of wildlife and animal lovers in the United States, and I'm one of them. So I don't want to knock people down by any means, but I just know that my experience of growing up in Virginia and then coming to live here, there is such passion here for their nature and their animals, and this sense of pride in it. It's part of their national pride, I would say. Like, it's bundled up with everything else. Whereas when I think of, you know, I'm telling people that I'm from Virginia, I don't necessarily brag about the squirrels or the dolphins. So I think just because of that, because it's wrapped up in their sense of self, they are much more likely to protect them. And obviously this does not apply to big corporations. And, you know, there's still loggers, they're building dams, and they are deforesting and all of that. But you'll see a lot of companies that do donate to, well, actually Tompkins is a great example of that. That was a private company. He was the founder of North Face, I believe. And after he died, he had it in his will to donate all of the land that he had purchased privately to the government, and had very strict rules that it had to be protected, so they can't build anything on it.
Anyone listening to this podcast probably loves animals, so I think we can all agree that it would be amazing if everyone in our country or state could feel a sense of pride for the animals that live in their area.
And I really don't have an answer for why it's so different, but I suspect that it might have to do with what I'll talk about in a little bit, which is that the native population, the indigenous population, is still pretty big here. And that is really a big part of their culture. And so perhaps if we had preserved a little bit more of that in the US, we would still have more of that positive view of the animals and um, a little bit more of what I'm talking about with, being proud of. Again, I'm not saying that not everybody's proud of squirrels and dolphins, but the level that I've seen the pride here is just over the top, and it's very beautiful to see.
There's also an event called Carnaval del Sur in Chile, and they find creative ways to teach conservation, which Danielle is going to talk to us about right after the break. To start off the new year, we're going to be doing something a little different in our breaks. I'm going to be teaching you a new science word every week. The first word is symbiosis. Symbiosis is when two different species have a relationship in the wild. Now, symbiotic relationships can be mutualistic, meaning that both individuals benefit. But there are two other types of symbiotic relationships. Predation and parasitism are when one individual benefits while the other individual is harmed. And finally, commensalism is when one individual benefits while the other one is not affected at all. Okay, we're back. Let's learn about Carnaval del Sur.
Along with the other organizations that I've been mentioning, this one, I have worked with them on their website as a designer, and the more that I've worked with them and learned about their mission, I just think it's such a great example of how you can teach about sciences, and in particular wildlife and conservation of nature and everything, in this very interdisciplinary way. So their mission is basically to take underprivileged children and give them skills in visual and performing arts, and then put on these performances for free for local audiences. And they've been doing it for years, and unfortunately, because of the pandemic, they weren't able to do it last year. They're doing it right now as we speak, actually. But it's beautiful if you see it, because we have a local park here, and the show itself is in the park. And so it lasts 2 entire days, and you go there and there's these kids ages 5 to 18 who are wearing these masks that they've built and painted themselves of the local flora and fauna. And so I'm talking, the parrot that I talked about, foxes, the monito del monte, which doesn't have somebody told me the English translation once, and it doesn't have a good English translation. It's this little rodent that's like a kangaroo type thing, like marsupial. And these kids have wearing these masks and have these whole costumes, and they're literally hanging from trees. So it's this whole performance, and then other children are playing violin in the background or dancing, and wearing these mushroom costumes. And so it's all about preserving the heritage of the culture and the local wildlife and flora and fauna, like I said. So yes, just seeing how art is involved and theater and getting it all together is a way to get kids excited about it, and not just, teaching them something from a textbook. So they're actually getting to experience it with all of their senses in their hometown. It's free. So I think it's a wonderful example of how they've really been able to, like I said, preserve their culture.
And that's such a great way to teach science. Incorporate other things that are relatable and that people enjoy. I believe this can help get more people to care about animal conservation. Speaking of creative ways to talk about animals, Danielle wrote and illustrated a book called The Other Forest. Let's hear more about it.
So when I was writing this book, initially, I didn't think of it as a conservation themed book, but because it's something that I am so passionate about, it ended up it ended up being a very big theme of it. But the overall plot is that there's a 12-year-old girl who is forced to move to Chile against her will because her father dies, and she moves with her mother, who was actually born here. So when she gets here, she's very stubborn. She decides that she doesn't want anything to do with this country at all. However, she then learns that the animals in the nearby forest have mysteriously disappeared. So when she agrees to go on a walk with her grandfather, then she finds this 1,000-year-old tree, which is actually a native tree from here called the illustrator tree. And she slips through it to this other forest where the animals can talk and her emotions affect the world around her by starting storms and all of these other things. But yes, there's a puma. There is that three-legged fox that I was talking about. There's a southern river otter and a lesser horned owl. Lots of other animals that are thrown in there. But yes, they are all their own characters, and it is very much a fantasy story. So I have gotten a little bit of pushback from some people in the animal rights, specifically the wildlife conservation arena, just because if you look at my cover right away, you're going to see that it's fantasy because it's two children riding through the forest on the back of a puma. And in the United States, this is definitely an issue to show humans touching animals. And I get it. And in my case, they're not only touching the animals, but they're riding on the animals. So in the case that I'm talking about with the pushback, a person who is a very well-known figure from a big cat rescue told me that this type of media actually negatively affects how people perceive animals and want to then own them or go to pay to pet cubs. So I get what this person was referring to. And it's interesting that I didn't actually think of that context at all because I live in Chile where those things are not allowed at all. They have very strict laws against owning any type of wild animal. I'm talking very, very strict. So I hadn't considered that it would be seen in that angle. And I respect that definitely, but it brought back a research article that I had read while I was writing it. And then I looked it up again, which talked about the fables from the Mapuche population here that are called epus. And they're filled with these animals like, again, foxes and pumas that teach kids stories. And they were studying specifically the communities that had lost this tradition versus the communities which still told these stories. And what they found was that in the communities where they had lost the tradition and no longer told these stories with the animals, there was a lot more conflict, specifically with carnivores. And the reason for that is because you can imagine if you're a child and you grow up being told a story of a puma as this guardian figure, which is what their stories are. They talk about the puma being a big brother coming down from the mountain and actually providing kind of a shelter or even food in some of the stories. Then you are less likely to be afraid of it, less likely to see it as a threat. Whereas if you haven't been told those stories and you have livestock, then the puma very much is going to be a threat. So to counter that argument that this activist was giving me that, fantasy stories where animals and humans are touching or interacting in this way can negatively affect conservation efforts, I would say that it's all about the context. And for me in particular, the context is that the animals travel to the forest where the animals are living and learn about what they've been having to go through with the loss of their forest, with the humans going in. And so they're then able to empathize with the animals and try to help them later on. And at the very end, spoiler alert, they learn that the animals will be better off without any human contact. So not the fairy tale ending that all kids might want. Maybe they will want to pet maybe they will want to pet a puma, but that is not what's actually best for that animal. So yes, animals should live free without human contact and all of that.
I think this story has a great message and can teach people that even though they may want to keep wild animals as pets, what's best for them is for us to leave them alone. And having books that put animals, especially carnivores, in a positive light is extremely important.
And I do think so with, big cats and other carnivores, there is a very fine line between fear and respect because you don't want to not fear them enough that you're going to go up to them and try to pet them, right? Like you want to give them your space. So you do want a healthy amount of respect for those animals. But yes, fear can be a dangerous thing if it causes you. I'll give an example of this actually like I said, there's so many pumas around the area that I live in the south of Chile, that the area where this wildlife rescue center is, we have a piece of land there. We haven't built anything there yet. However, we're in one of the chats with a bunch of the neighbors, and they all the time are talking about, unfortunately, one time a puma was hit by a car, and all of the neighbors were very upset about that, very angry, told people to slow down. However, what's happening now is that just this week, actually, somebody lost 13 sheep to a puma attack. And so they're asking, well, what can we do? Can we call the SAG, which is the government organization that deals with wild animals? And I didn't say anything, but in my mind, I'm thinking everybody who's bought a piece of land in that area knows what we were doing when we bought that piece of land. And actually, we bought a piece of land that had been stripped bare, and we've already planted 40 trees on it. So we are trying to, kind of reforest in a way. But what I'm trying to say is everybody who's bought a piece of land there knows that these animals are living there, and we basically are invading their space. And this is what comes with that. And there's all you're going to do by calling this organization is that they're going to come, and if they do find this animal, they're going to do one of two things. They're going to move it, and then that animal is going to be disoriented and probably have the same problem somewhere else. Or they're going to drop it off at the animal rescue center, where all they're going to do is quote unquote rehabilitate it and try to re-release it. So I don't know what the solution is in terms of livestock, but I do think that we need to kind of convince ourselves that if we're going to be sharing a space with animals, we need to stop thinking about it as our space and more as we are moving in on their space. And what does that mean? And what is our responsibility with that? Because yes, there was a loss of animal life. The sheep died, and that's terrible. Like I'm a huge animal lover. I think that's terrible, but does it mean that there needs to be negative consequences for that puma? I would say no.
That's really interesting to think about because we want to respect these animals, but they could also be dangerous to the people around them. So I wanted to know if there's something that the average person can do to play a part in storytelling to help with animal conservation.
Oh my gosh, yes. I mean, I was not an author or a writer by any means before I started this journey. It took me a very long time. It took me over 3 years just because I had no idea what I was doing. But I think every person has that creativity within them. And I do think that oral storytelling is 1,000-year-old tradition. And I know that parents in particular are so used to making up stories for their kids. And I would just say, when you're doing that, make sure that you're not always making the shark the villain, like you said, or, don't have a swarm of bats come in to terrorize the main character. Just be a little bit more conscious of, because there are patterns that repeat, right? So we constantly are having the same animals act as the bad guys. And it's the same thing with colors, right? So it's always a black jaguar that's the villain. Well, why, and that can weigh on kids too. Why is it always a black animal and that has to do with these negative stereotypes of why black cats don't get adopted from shelters. So I think parents who don't want to go write a book, right? They can still influence their own kids by making up bedtime stories where they're going against these negative stereotypes and just kind of flipping them on their head. Have the bat be the good guy. Have the bat live with fairies and, have his own life story. You can do whatever you want in your stories. Just so, yeah, anybody can have an impact on their own kids or even their niece and nephews. I read my book to my niece and nephews. You don't have to have your own kids. So yes, you can definitely have an impact on the next generation.
So that goes to show that it's really easy to make a difference just by switching up who's the good guy versus who's the bad guy in your stories.
And what I think about is what I talked about with the United States not having a law that protects these big cats from private ownership. Well, let's think about that. If we start with kids and kind of telling them these stories to where they're empathizing with these cats from a young age, who knows? Maybe they'll grow up and become senators and then pass those laws, which we're unable to pass nowadays because the senators that we have just don't care enough. I know that they have a lot on their plates, but they maybe weren't told the right stories when they were kids and aren't empathizing enough with these animals. So yes, that's what I believe.
And Danielle also mentioned how art and storytelling aren't only great ways to get people interested in conservation, they're also extremely therapeutic.
Art is very therapeutic for me, definitely with the pandemic. I used to think of myself as an extrovert, but I found myself to be a very introverted extrovert, meaning that I can spend a lot of time by myself indoors. And the one thing that's made it so that I just don't go absolutely mental is having a long-term art project. And this can be different things for different people. There's some people who knit, there's some people who do puzzles, and I just happen to do visual art. So I do watercolor and colored pencils. And when I got to a point where I put that project on hold, I kind of had a little bit of a crisis where I needed something else to fill that time and kind of make me mentally stable. Last year I was dealing with insomnia, and I definitely think that art helps that, and writing. Writing is another art form. Just any kind of creativity that allows you to get that release that you need. Yes, definitely will help you, and definitely helped me. And I would say that kids, the same thing, just coloring. They've done lots of research on coloring. So even if you're not coming up with your own characters and doing lots of, critical thinking, just coloring, just get that energy out. So yes, it all helps.
That interview was so awesome. I'm glad I was able to talk to someone who has experienced a completely different culture than I have. And I think we can all learn from the people living in Chile to have more pride in our native species. One thing I think we can really take away from this interview is that you don't have to be a conservation biologist in order to make a huge impact in conservation. And if you want some free art activities, you can go to Danielle's website, Danielle, Koehler.com. Thank you so much for coming on this adventure with me as we explored creative conservation. You can find the sources that we used for this podcast and links to organizations that we reference at onwildlife.org. You can also email us with any questions at onwildlife.podcast@gmail.com. And you can follow us on Instagram at @on_wildlife and on TikTok at @onwildlife. Don't forget to tune in next Wednesday for another awesome episode. And that's On Wildlife.
You've been listening to On Wildlife with Alex Ray. On Wildlife provides general educational information on various topics as a public service, which should not be construed as professional, financial, real estate, tax, or legal advice. These are our personal opinions only. Please refer to our full disclaimer policy on our website for full details.